Italian Carabinieri Deputy Commanding General, Lieutenant General Maurizio De Talmo Mezzaville, will now deliver his opening remarks.
Good morning, buongiorno to you all, distinguished authorities, esteemed professors, fellow officers, UN representatives. Let me say also General Coppola, if I can, my friend. Here, Eurogen 4 Permanent Headquarters Commander and NATO Stability Policing Center of Excellence Director and personnel. Also on behalf of the Carabinieri Commanding General, Lieutenant General Teo Luzzi, I'm delighted to warmly welcome you to Vicenza and the Center of Excellence for the Stability Policy Units. Let me start with a thought and expressing my vicinity and sincere condolences of the Carabinieri to the Turkish and to the Syrian populace affected by an immense tragedy. I'm pleased to open this conference regarding lessons learned and future strategies with reference to geopolitics and peace operations. The Carabinieri General Headquarters is deeply convinced that in order to further advance in the research and doctrinal development of the police and military components in the framework of peace operation, it's crucial to cooperate and collaborate closely with universities, civilian research institutes, and think tanks. This event clearly represents a remarkable step in this direction. The geopolitical environment has changed significantly in the recent history. It is currently characterized by a widespread instability highlighted by the conflict in East Europe and increasingly aggressive behaviors among certain emerging powers. This environment presents an immediate challenge to the foreign and security policy decisions of the nations and international organizations involved in peace operations. Key political challenges are posed by diverging regional interests, the transformations of the multilateralism, climate change, migration flows, terrorism, competition for energy supplies, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence, just to name a few. Geographically, the area of major concern for the Carabinieri as component of the Italian defense is undoubtedly the so-called enlarged Mediterranean, West Balkans, and Africa, where we substantially contribute with personnel deployed to UN, EU, NATO, and bilateral missions. I'm consequently very interested and look forward to hearing from the distinguished panelists, confident that their vast knowledge, expertise, and experience will contribute to a better understanding of the connections between geopolitics and peace operations, helping to identify valuable lessons learned and developing strategies to conduct more effective peace operations. Thank you to you all, and again, thank you for being here.
The moderator for this conference will be Professor Laris Geiser from Cattolica University Milan and University of Ljubljana, currently K4 Senior Political Advisor.
Well, thank you very much, Deputy Commanding General, Director, Colonel Daniels, authorities, colleagues, professors, and students. Welcome today, and those that are here in this hall, and all those that are connected online, and also to all professors that are ready to intervene on the VTC. I thank you very much, Director, for pulling me back home. It's a pleasure to be here finally again in COESPO. And I'm very pleased, of course, to moderate this event, not only because I believe that geopolitics are very much important, not only because I teach geopolitics, but because I believe that geopolitics are shaping the international environment and that peace operations are important, especially coming now from K4. I can guarantee that what COESP is doing is of extreme importance for the international community. And I'm really witnessing this daily. First of all, Director, let me bring you the apologies of Director of Limes Geopolitical Review, Dr. Lucio Caracciolo. He was intended to be part of this event today. Unfortunately, due to an urgent matter, he cannot attend this event. Anyhow, he asked me to present the best wishes and his regards. Also on behalf of Limes, given that I am part of the scientific board of the Limes Review, I would like just to recall that Limes has been founded in the 90s. Why in the 90s? Well, the reason was a geopolitical reason. It was the war in Yugoslavia. And the war in Yugoslavia still today has a lot of consequences for our region, for Europe, and for the world. And it was the first time that the word geopolitics was brought in the Italian public debate. Today, geopolitics are a normal topic on television and in the public opinion. Anyhow, peace operations as part of geopolitics can be seen in two different points of view, I think. Peace operations are the consequences of big geopolitical events, tensions, war. But on the other side, I can say that the peace operations are also a tool of the international community for politics. The longer that peace operation lasts, the more the peace operation has become a tool of politics for the international community. And I'm sure that all our guests today in the two coming panels will have a lot to explain us and to share with us how important these two topics, geopolitics and peace operations, are for us and for our international community. My role, believe me, will be very small because, as you see, we have two panels that are absolutely full, intense, with our highly, I have to say, respected, internationally respected speakers. I would like to open immediately, given that we will run for sure out of time, I would like to immediately open the first panel with our first speaker, first guest, that is Admiral Fernando Sanfelice di Monteforte, that I think is with us online. Is correct?
Good afternoon. Do you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Admiral. Admiral is since 2008 president of a think tank that has a very clear name, Mediterranean Insecurity. Before that, he has been, among all other, of course, posts, also Chief of Staff at SHAPE and Commander of the Operation Active Endeavor. He published a very interesting book that is Strategy and Peace. And today, I'm sure he will draw us the importance that the strategic doctrine has in peace operation. Probably, I hope so, comparing the Italian doctrine with the British and the American, very likely. Admiral, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Professor Guys. Yes, of course, I will also compare the Italian approach to the others, but let me see, 1 moment. There's something which, okay, here we are. I have followed from staff positions peace support operations from 93 to 2008, basically almost 15 years. And I've noted that they are deeply different schools of thought. And these approaches, though, are well rooted in history. So I will give you a very quick overview of the different schools of thought, starting with the general consideration that we felt erroneously that stabilization operations were something new. In fact, there is a long tradition in strategic theory which comes from the mid 19th century. I don't need to recall that for centuries the occupying power either exterminated, enslaved, or deported the local population. And starting with Napoleon in Spain, instead, powers took care to stabilize a nation without committing genocides. The same happened to the colonial powers, and since 1991, we try to prevent the instability in a region from spreading pell-mell, thus creating a spiralizing effect, having irreparable consequences. So, experiences of the past are useful and needed. Starting with Antoine-Henri Jomini, Brigadier General in the Napoleon's army, who witnessed the operations of Napoleon in Spain. And he derived a number of strategic lessons. First, the dimensioning of a stabilizing force must not necessarily be connected to the total surface of the territory to be stabilized, but must be tailored to the scope of the operation and to the obstacles which are expected. One thing has to be avoided absolutely. Never exasperate the population. And you cannot make recourse to ideology, because ideology without the needs is worthless and sometimes is even counterproductive. These were the first lessons learned by a guy like Jomini, who I will recall became the strategic counselor of the Tsar of Russia. One of the innovations brought by Jomini was the terminologic innovation of the name of term guerrilla. Guerrilla, which replaced a more famous term, guerre de peuple, war of the people, which had been coined by Frederick the Great of Prussia. Different were the lessons learned by Colwell. Colwell was the number 2 of Lord Kitchener. Lord Kitchener, you might recall, was the inventor of the lager, and he arranged the lagers in South Africa. He considered that the main scope of the small war was to crush the population, even to resorting to cattle lifting and hungeries of other kinds. This would lead, he was aware, to a protracted, thankless and invertebrate war. The term will come back in another school of thought. And he said, yes, you have to use the big hammer against the population, especially in semi-civilized countries, but you must recall that clemency and firmness are an inseparable mix. What is strange is that he praised General Hoche. You might be aware that General Hoche is in our days under scrutiny for the mass slaughter in Vendée. After Colwell, there is the US Marine Corps doc, a book which is not very well known, is titled Small Wars Manual. It was published in 1940 and then quickly buried in the following years. And the Marine Corps were deeply involved in stabilizing the Philippines, something which is one of the most successful activities of stabilization, to the extent that the population fought against the Japanese on behalf of the Americans, even after the Japanese occupation. And of course, they deserve a big credit. But the biggest credit of Philippine stabilization was to be attributed to Mr. Taft, who later became President of the United States. And in this book, Small Wars Manual, there is the complete unease of the military, who for the first time were compelled to be very careful in not hurting the population. You remember what Jomini said. And the US Marines started by saying that the main character of a small war is uncertainty. Uncertainty of directives, uncertainty of conduct. But the main activity to be carried out was to adapt oneself to the character of the population in order to avoid or to minimize their reaction. The key for stabilization was the economic welfare of the occupied country, providing new jobs, providing a higher degree of welfare was, and I can say still is, the biggest advantage which can be brought for the success of the population. Of course, the Marine Corps warned the successors that local use is often dangerous, imbued with an ardent enthusiasm and capable of heroism to the extent of giving their lives unhesitatingly. It's worth recalling that there were a number of suicide attacks against the Marines, to the extent that the Marines adopted a bigger handgun, the Colt 45, because 38 was not enough to stop a suicide attack. Completely different is the French approach. French approach was not and has never been of general use. It was an approach adopted by General Gallieni and later by one of his lieutenants, General Lyotet, and was rediscovered in the 1990s by a French general, General Chalion. And Gallieni, who pacified Madagascar, said we had to follow an oil spot strategy. We do not have forces enough to control the whole of territory. We have to create areas which are at the same time protected and rich with a lot of welfare. The first thing that Gallieni did when entering in a new village or town was to open a market and to open a school. Because he was convinced that immediately visible economic improvements were the key for success. This means that the very first days of an operation of stabilization are really crucial. And they are crucial because a stabilization will be successful only, to use Gallieni's word, only if the population will become the main ally of the force. Professor Geiser asked me to speak about Italy, and the doctrine of Italy is very close to Gallieni's approach. Attention to the needs of the population, training of local security forces, demonstrate the good intent by deeds, by practical deeds, to practice collaboration, not benevolent assimilation, a term which was used by President Taft in the Philippines. And the doctrine of Italy says the very first days are crucial. To conclude, in fact, the key for a stabilizing operation is when the people will be tired of war, and this will be the first key to success. Then we must be careful to avoid the strong collective feelings, already Jomini has said, and forget military part alone. The military part will be effective only if will be a component of the grand strategy. Going back before concluding in my 10 minutes my speech to the last bullet of the Italian doctrine. There is a general of the United States, General Pete Chiarelli, clearly of Italian origin, who said the populations are not only divided among favorables to be valued to achieve our own ends and opponents to be fought without respite. The majority of the local population is at least initially neutral, observes what happens. This important part of the population has been appropriately labeled as fence sitters. This means that we have to take care of the majority of the population, which will be neither favorable nor opposing us, but might become very dangerous. Thank you.
Admiral, I thank you very much for two things. Of course, the first for reminding us the extreme importance, of course, of the population in the operations, and the second for sticking to perfect 10 minutes that we agreed for for your speech. So thanks a lot, because unfortunately we have really to respect the time schedule today. Otherwise, we can't manage the two panels. Thank you very much. I would like just maybe to introduce to all Jomini, Clausewitz and company, also my friend, I love him, from Metternich, that always said that stability does not mean immobility, and the peace operation is a really long process that has always to run in order to maintain the stability and to secure the so-called fence. So thank you very much, Admiral. Stay with us. Maybe if we all stick to the 10 minutes, we can have in the first panel also some Q&A session. And now I would like to invite on the podium the Lieutenant General Vincenzo Coppola from Carabinieri, former Deputy Commanding General of the Carabinieri, Civil Operation Commander and Director of the Civilian Planning and Conduct Capability of the EU, Head of EU Police Mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Head of the Police Units in the Council of Europe. As we agree, I think that your point of view will show us, you will share with us the incongruence of the long political debate, the mandate of the missions, the dichotomy between the operational and financial structure inside the European Union, and the added value of the civilian aspects of crisis management inside the political visibility of the European Union. Thank you, General, for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, colleagues, all of you. I'm not briefing you. I'm just expressing some consideration that I had the opportunity to mature during my previous assignment inside the European Union, and more specifically inside the civilian crisis management operations. As already said, mentioned in my CV, I was the first head of the police unit, and the police unit was the structure deputed in 2001 to build the civilian crisis management capabilities inside the European Union. At the time, there was no EEAS, the European External Action Service, but we were working inside the Council of the European Union, DG9, DGE, and DG9. So that small unit made of 7, later 8, compared to the military staff, which was at the very beginning 120, today 250 more. We had to build what was the base of the civilian crisis management, which was a nice exercise because we were starting from nothing, from the very bottom of it. Just a few lines inside the council decision of ERA and Nice, nothing more. Nevertheless, we were able in less than 1 year to plan and launch the first ever mission, CSDP mission, that was a civilian mission, the EUPM, the European Union Police Mission. Why I mention this? I mention this because at the very beginning, the ambition of the European Union was very high. They wanted to participate, they wanted to say something on the international fora. And so the opportunity given to us by the United Nations, which proposed the European Union to follow on IPTF, the International Police Task Force made by United Nations in Bosnia, with a European mission, later the EU Police Mission. But then, immediately after, we launched the second mission that was in Fyrom at the time, North Macedonia today, very short in time, little more than 1 year with small ambitions, while EUPM lasted for almost 10 years on the ground. And so on and so forth until today, when European Union has deployed 11 missions on the ground and 12 mission is under political consideration. The focus of the mission is mainly in supporting the police, the security structure, not the defense structure, the security structure, police, the judicial, and other things that can go along. So very civilian. And it's important to say, because when we speak about supporting civilian structures, there is little debate. I mean, the political debate is very long, and I will touch upon this. But generally, you don't face any criticism on this kind of approach. Actually, it's very much needed and requested. But now we go to those aspects which should be reconsidered or better considered by the European Union. Things that I say today to you, I already said in Brussels many times. I said and wrote in Brussels many times. So I'm not talking because I'm out of this. There is an incongruence in the European Union. The political debate to launch the mission is very long. The decision taken, the PSC, supported by the CIFCOM decisions, is very long. The debate is normally quite complex until the decision is taken to launch the mission. But a problem that we always face in the European Union is that the European Union doesn't trust its own decisions. And why say so? Because they decide to launch the mission after a long debate. Normally it takes 1 year to decide on the launching of a mission and have the planning phase started and put in place. The planning phase, not the mission itself. But the mandate of the mission is always very short, normally 2 years, to be reviewed every 2 years and to be eventually extended. And this is a major problem. The reason for this are multiple. There are financial concerns. There is a political debate about the length of the missions. But a short-term mission means that you can only have small projects, short projects. If I consider a mission of 10 years, I can take children from 10 and bring him to the university, just to give an example. I can build a motorway, while in 2 years, maybe I can repair a small road, just to give an example. Of course, this is not the job. If you want to rebuild the police force or you want to restructure the judicial system of a country, it cannot take 2 years. If you want to support the administration of a country, you cannot do this in 2 years. You can spend a lot of money, but you are not sure that to put in place systems and institutions that will last over time. And this is a problem. And if we look at what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina after 10 years of the mission on the ground, when UPM was withdrawn, immediately after, the local institution, which I've been head of UPM, I managed to reinforce through the police reform, which was a major political and strategic debate in Bosnia. Immediately after, as I said, those institutions started to split apart. So this was a problem. The mission, which lasted 10 years with 2 years review of the mandate, every 2 years review of the mandate, lasted not enough. And all the missions that we have put in place lasted at least 5, 6, 7 years, even more. But nevertheless, we stay on the short mandate, and the short mandate is a major problem for the mission. This is something that was never achieved because the European Union doesn't trust its own decisions. So they continuously want to reconsider, to review, to rediscuss, and change something, which is a problem. Another problem of the European Union in managing the operation is that those who manage the operation are different from those who manage the financing of the operation. Now everybody knows that whoever manages the finance manages the reality. If you cannot spend the money, if you don't have the money you need at the time you need it, I don't say that you will fail, but certainly you will face major problems. But this is something that was never decided upon until today. So you have the civilian operations commander. I say something about the civilian operation commander. The civilian operation commander, which is mentioned like this in the doctrine, is the only European Union commander. There is not a military operation commander. There is a chairman of the military committee. There is the director, not commander, of the military staff. But there is no military commander in Brussels. The commanders are always on the ground. While on the civilian side, you have the operational commander, the civilian operations commander in Brussels. I was the commander of the, at the time, 10, later 11 missions on the ground. The head of mission depended from me, not from anybody else. This is extremely important. But nevertheless, I was not in the position to manage myself the funding of the missions, to allocate the resources, to control the allocation of the resources on the ground. This was done at the time when I was there. I ended in 2020. Was done by another structure, which was at the time the foreign policy instrument, managed by a civilian, of course. Now the same structure is called the instrument contributing to stability and peace. I would like to drive your attention to this, even on the terms. Foreign policy instruments is far more proactive as a name than instrument contributing to stability and peace. Once again, you don't allocate to a specific institution, a specific structure, capabilities on its own. This is interesting. There is always this double control, triple control on everything. So this is the problem. When I needed money, or I needed to reallocate from a budget line to another the funding of a mission, of course in accordance with the mission, upon the request, upon the needs of the mission, I had to negotiate this with someone else. This losing a lot of time. Sometimes not so long, but nevertheless losing time. Never having the possibility to immediately intervene where it was needed, at the time it was needed. I will rush a little bit through these things because I don't have so much time. Military and civilian. The coordination between military and civilian is a long debate, still ongoing in the European Union. Of course, the two have different tasks, but sometime, not very often. Kosovo was one of those places, but certainly in Bosnia it was, where you have the presence of the European Union, military and civilian. You have to coordinate because, of course, they both belong to the same institution, to the European Union. So this was left at the time to the goodwill of the actors on the ground, the head of the mission, the civilian mission, and the commander of the military mission. Later, the decision was taken to build a civil-military coordination cell between the military staff in Brussels and the CPCC. The CPCC is the Civilian Planning and Conduct Capability, the staff of the Civilian Operation Command. So to have a cell where to coordinate the respective responsibilities on the ground, where you had the presence of the two missions, military and civilian. Well, that cell was established, was requested, and it took 4 years to sign a two-paper memorandum between the military and the civilian to decide that, yes, we have a civilian coordination cell, we have a civil-military coordination cell, which will be effective starting from tomorrow. So once again, the decisions are taken, then are let there, training around, moving around until someone takes the decision to make them work. The final aspect, the civilian operation side. Well, the civilian instruments are extremely important for the European Union. They are not controversial. While when we deploy military operations, there is always a debate because, of course, this can have a more political effect on the ground, the military presence. The civilian operations are quite visible on the ground. We have, do you know that we have a mission ongoing in Libya, in Tripoli? Do you know that we have one in Ukraine, in Kiev, working in Kiev? For some months it was in Moldavia, then it was redeployed in Kiev. Nobody knows. Or at least only those who are very much inside the European Union, they know. Otherwise, nobody knows. Nobody knows how many missions we have in Africa or in Middle East. We have two missions, one in Palestine and one in Jericho. Nobody knows, even if those missions are extremely visible. Imagine what was the problem to deploy a mission in Palestine to overcome the reluctance of the Israeli. Nevertheless, the mission is there, it's working, and now it's working quite well. But they are not visible. They are just visible in the inner circle of the European Union. While knowing of the presence of those missions and having a good approach to them, they can certainly favor a more effective presence of the international community on the ground. We have in Mali, we have in Niger, we have in Central African Republic, we have in Somalia, and so on and so forth. We have in Kosovo, and we have in Georgia. So a number of missions which are extremely important, quite effective. The length of the mandate sometimes hampers the capability of the mission to be very effective, but they are quite effective. But nevertheless, nobody knows. And they are, as I said before, limited to the inner circle. The knowledge about them and what they do and how they can be used. So, just to complete this short presentation, then of course I will be ready to answer to your question, your curiosity. European Union has a major instrument, a major political strategic instrument, the civilian side, the civilian operations, but it's the same European Union is not so much fond of them. They continue to review the missions. They don't trust the personnel that they have put on the ground, or they trust limited. They limitedly trust the personnel on the ground. They quite seldom, quite rarely, request the opinion of the civilian operation commander or the head of missions, apart from presentations that are done every other month or every 3 months by the mission themselves. They continue to change the structures. The structure of the CPCC, which was established in 2007, has already been changed 3 times, and once actually I had to change it because it wasn't working. And so this continuous change, this limited trust on the operation themselves, make them working but not so effectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. EU, as always, a work in progress. If may I just add to what you say, that I can say that we can just confirm that not trusting in people and the problem of the length of mandate is something that is mirrored also in the problem that how the local authorities are respecting you. So how they trust you, how they respect you, and on the reliability of all the mission. So yes, thank you very much. Let's move on with a friend, also my boss in its time, Catholic University of Sacred Heart of Milano, Marco Lombardi. Marco Lombardi is a professor of sociology, communication, and it's a great expert of crisis management, terrorism, and post-conflict policies. Marco, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Laris. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Generale Coppola. You completely changed my idea of my intervention. You made me, I feel myself a mission in some way. I say, I have to talk about my experience as Catholic University in Afghanistan. I managed 8 missions in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2015, together with the 23 other Italian colleagues of my university. But I wish to join this experience with my personal mission in some way of the last 4 years, where I went several times to Somalia, to Libya, to Syria, traveling next month to Iraq and to Ukraine. And sometimes I ask myself not why I do that, but which is my status while doing this kind of mission. And in some way, this is the real question behind the description, the legacy I want to bring you from Afghanistan, which is the status of any civilians joining, or in a quite flexible way, military operation on the field. I start from Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, as Catholic University, we manage a project in Tanjikaro, 40 kilometers north of Kabul, a school where we trained teachers for 4 years, and we provided scholarship for the families, for the parents keeping the female at school. And the school had a boom at the end, from 3,000 people to 700, from 300 to 700 people, most of them female. Then we managed courses at the Department of Women Affairs in Herat, and in the Herat University, we managed 5 years courses for female journalists. So we trained 25 female to become journalists, and they work together with the European media for years, providing a lot of interesting information, okay? Different perspective than the one we can get as European moving in Afghanistan. Now, most of these guys are calling me each day asking, what are you doing for us now? We are waiting for you. Please help me. Just a call while I was coming here. She is somewhere hidden in Kabul. But what is interesting that Qatar, just to bring together the same mission. The question was really simple when it started. You, the army, you are building schools, a lot of schools, 100 schools. But if you do not build teachers, you just build building, not school. So do not be surprised if the African bring gods into the school, because they are not yet school without pupils and without teachers. So we have to go together. You build the school, we build the teachers. And that was the starting of this flexible, interesting cooperation we had for years on the field, where we, as professor of the Catholic University, joined the army. We were hosts in the PRT. The PRT provide, of course, security for us and any logistic, but we were free in the PRT and to have a relation with the university and to meet our project, of course, joined and discuss with the command, but the project was the result of the discussion between me and the command in the PRT in those years. It was really a flexible way to operate in a different situation. The legacy, I experienced a lot of interesting topics, let me say. The first, the problem arose in between militaries and NGOs on the field. It was incredible. And there is a problem of awareness and respect, mutual respect. For sure, still an ideological refusal to work with the military team, accused not to having either technical or ethical requirement to operate. That was a great discussion on the field. The lack of recognition that in the regimes generated by a state of crisis in which we operate, it is easier for military institutions to penetrate local institutions because they are culturally closer. In these countries, there is not often civil society, and therefore it's unrealistic for NGOs to turn to this one that has yet to be built. And the last, the lack of awareness that there is an objective need for physical security that must be guaranteed by the military to operate effectively by civilians. This is a key point. And overcoming still the romantic vision of the protected cooperation operator because it does good. That's bullshit. It doesn't make sense, this kind of position. So there is a lot of work to do. But it is a mutual work, not only a reciprocal understanding, but also I think we have to reorganize the way to go on the field, military and civilian together. I stress military and civilian together because we have to give the possibility to the people to move from the designated victims to possible actors. This is a key point. When we move from hybrid warfare to cognitive warfare, especially at the present, still people feel themselves as the victim, designated victims of the cognitive warfare. It is a proactive chance, the one to involve civilians together with military to provide an answer to their community. Because it is a proactive way to bring the victim to the actors of the future. And it is from a cultural, but also a very practical point, a way to bring their heart and to work together with them. I know I have to close. I cut a lot of my consideration. I think that the legacy from my experience is that we have, even when we are still engaged in combat operation, it is necessary to develop a comprehensive approach that characterizes civil military operation, equipped with its own resources, coordinated with the international community, and inclusive of the expression of the local government. We have to take the risk. Okay, this is something that includes military, civilian, and governmental, of course. If the government, the politics, do not take the risk to have some laws, of course, I criticize a lot when we closed the PRT in Afghanistan after the attack we had. I can understand, because there is no politician that can survive the losing of any biological life, especially of any voluntary on the field. But this is the way to lose the entire field if we do not take the risk. And this is something that needs politician, military, and civilian to be involved. The ultimate objective of the military mission cannot be achieved without having developed an effective system of competencies and capabilities that is already transversal to military and civilian domain. And this is a key point that, for me, COESPO can develop. COESPO can be a key actor on this perspective. This system of skill of capability is the result, and this is why COESPO can be a key actor, is the result of a joint planning and constant exercise, which also include the dissemination of best practices, lessons learned through training programs for military and civilian together. Why COESPO? Of course, we have the fantastic center in military cooperation, civil military cooperation. I suppose the commander is here. I stress COESPO because we need, let me say, a new flexibility. I understand the Italian model of riserva selezionata, experienced on the field. Sometimes it was really terrible experience, worse than the one with NGOs, but sorry to always so frankly for that. But because the spirit of some of these guys is the one to be afraid to be a civilian, to prefer to be a military when you miss the possibility in your young life to be a military. I mean, it's a long discourse. This one, we have to reshape, and this is my message that I leave to COESPO. We have to reshape the organization of civilian and military cooperation in the critical area in a proactive way, because we cannot wait peace to promote this kind of cooperation, especially because we do not know when peace is or war is. We have to anticipate, but the organization we have now is not enough for this kind of situation. So I really wish that COESPO can lead a new, first, theoretical perspective, second, a new organization toward this perspective, third, to apply the perspective in a new training, international possibilities given to military and civilian together. Thank you.
Marco, I thank you very much for this exceptional example of cooperation between university and defense sector abroad. And well, thank you very much also for having stolen my final thinking that I was I wrote it down here to deliver to the director of COESPO, because I really believe too that COESPO could be the right environment for developing this kind of, let's say, doctrine for the future. You're taking note, director. Thank you. That's good. Perfect. So now it's the moment of a very good friend of COESPO. It is with us the General Brigadier Giorgio Puzzelli. Thank you very much for coming. General, you as you are bringing to on the podium extend very long experience in NATO system and abroad. You have been deployed in several operations in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, and I really look forward for your presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much to you. So, General Mizzavilla, General Babano, Colonel Daniel, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen in presence and distance, it is for me both a honor and a privilege to be asked to you today here at the COESPA. So first of all, let me thank you for a very kind and much appreciated invitation, which confirms a long-standing bond with this institution. Secondly, I must warn you that the task given to me by the good Dr. Geiser, that is to frame peace operations within the boundaries of international relations in less than 10 minutes, is almost impossible to fulfill. Therefore, do not expect miracles from me. I'll do my best. Firstly, I will outline the relevance of military options contemplated in the UN Charter as an effective tool to tackle conflicts compared to the paucity of solutions previously offered by the League of Nations, which led to World War II. Secondly, I will underline the difficulties faced by multinational interventions in a world frozen by the bipolar confrontation during the Cold War, and the notion of Trinity-led peacekeeping, or Chapter 6.5 being the first consequence. Thirdly, I will look at the spread of multinational interventions after the end of the Cold War up to the global war on terrorism, but from the point of view of the US-led liberal order and of critical voices opposing. Fourthly, I will look at the late evolution of multinational military interventions in face of state-building challenges, asymmetric threats, and revisionist state and non-state actors. Finally, I will ask myself if multinational operations, as contemplated in the UN Charter, still have a place in a multipolar world which is characterized by a durable hybrid competition pursued by revisionist powers. It is a fact that peace operations as we know them nowadays were introduced by the UN Charter after the end of the Second World War. While the 20s and the 30s of the last century saw a number of interventions aimed at supporting the respect of international agreements, it is a recognized fact that the League of Nations, although aimed at providing collective security, lacked sufficient muscle to impose its will on recalcitrant nations. Thus, the Charter, with the provisions set in Chapters 6 and 7, opened the way to a different way of doing business when international peace and stability were at stake. Nevertheless, while the Charter in itself had and still has a marvelous sound to our ears, its implementation was left to the goodwill of major nations who still put a premium on sovereignty. Add to this the bipolar confrontation, and we see that magnificent notion of a central staff with forces permanently assigned to the organization never coming to complete fruition. Was the Charter a lame duck since the beginning? No, because the clairvoyance of men such as Dag Hammarskjöld made up for objectively difficult circumstances. Hammarskjöld made up for in a world marked by a ruthless ideological confrontation between superpowers, in which former European empires were dissolving under the attack of decolonization. He and his successors were able to introduce such practical adaptations to the rules as to make them palatable to most nations and allow the UN to intervene in a number of conflicts. The trick, as we can call it, was the introduction of the so-called Trinity of Chapter 6.5, per se a ruse susceptible of meeting the concerns of established nations and newly born allies. The idea that you could intervene only if the parties agreed, that you had to maintain absolute neutrality between them, and that you could use violence only to defend yourself, was absolutely revolutionary in the domain of international relations, and opened the way to success, albeit with some limitations. The end of the Cold War, with the demise of the bipolar order imposed by the superpowers, opened the way to an age of disorder in which all tools available to the international community were put at work. While on one hand, the 90s of the last century saw the implementation of what scholars call the liberal order, namely an organization of the world inspired by the United States and based on interdependence and multilateralism. On the other hand, the collapse of the old system and the resurgence of traditional ambitions put in jeopardy the balance of many regions in the planet. The answer of the international community was to put to work the United Nations, or coalitions sponsored by the United Nations, and to intervene whenever peace and stability were threatened, with or sometimes without the consent of parties concerned. While we speak of 5 generations of peace operations since the 60s, 5 generations quite different from the point of view of mandate, consent, strength, and use of force, with all due respect for those who gave their lives for the cause of peace, we can now say with hindsight that some of these later interventions, while solicited by public opinion, were only partly justified and in some cases were so badly managed as to do more harm than good. However, the most important consequence of those interventions, aside from a long due review of procedures conducted by the UN, was a ferocious reaction of a part of the world which openly accused the West of having a biased attitude towards the rest, of being neocolonialist, and of pursuing peace operations for unspeakable ends, regardless of the principles of sovereignty and non-interference grounded in international law. The strongest response to Western interventionism manifested itself in the Islamic world and led directly to the rise of what we call nowadays violent religious extremism. The consequences of this rise are well known. 20 years of global war of terrorism, which saw and still see the West and its allies engaged on 5 continents in a struggle to defend their values and style of life against a ruthless and determined enemy. The reaction of part of the world to Western interventionism and the difficulties encountered by the international community in managing conflicts led to a deep reassessment of the nature, purpose, and modus operandi of peace operations. Within the first decade of the 21st century, the UN came to the conclusion that interventions had to change. It was not anymore a matter of imposing and maintaining temporary peace, but of creating lasting conditions. As Galtung noted, creating the conditions for a good peace that removes the causes of confrontation, as opposed to a bad one which simply stops the war but does not address the root causes of violence. Thus, the accent on peace building in multidimensional operations, in which the security side is but one of the defining aspects of a global political and economic commitment. All the more in situations in which the presence of the international community is contested by a third party, state or non-state actors, which pursue their ends through violent, asymmetric confrontations. This appears to be the last frontier of peace operations from a military point of view, and this has led to a diversification of tasks between advanced nations, more ready to take the military challenges in their hands, and less developed nations who still look with suspicion at the principle of imposing on others the will of the international community. Nevertheless, while in the field peacekeepers face asymmetric threats, nowadays the real challenge lies, in my opinion, in the political arena. Issues are known. The retrenchment of the United States in face of the difficulties of governing a recalcitrant world, the resulting void in international affairs, the parallel lack of another actor strong enough to replace the only superpower left on the planet. All this has contributed to the rise of so-called revisionist states, or revisionist powers, as you may like to call them, who simply do not abide to an international system based on liberal values and mutually accepted rules. Revisionist states who openly challenge the principle itself of international engagement for the sake of traditional sovereignty, non-interference, and national interest, and push towards a multipolar, regional-based world. In such a world, the principle itself of peace operations is at stake, as much as the grounding of the UN Charter itself is at stake. So, in conclusion, the big question, which I leave to your attention, is now whether we have turned full circle and we are back in 1648 in a Westphalian, Hobbesian universe based solely on the balance of power, a nasty, brutish, and selfish world in the world of Thomas Hobbes, or we can still count on the goodwill of mankind. It's up to us to decide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, General, for reminding us how politics are very much important in defining the peace operation and what you call the create the condition of the good peace. If this good peace can ever be achieved, otherwise we can only have a frozen conflict. We have a lot of frozen conflict in the world in this moment, unfortunately, because we didn't map the good peace fundaments at the beginning of a peace operation. Anyhow, well done. Mission accomplished in 10 minutes, General. Don't see me as an enemy. Can you imagine being part of the second panel? 6 minutes will be the deadline later. So let's move forward. Sara, it's your moment. Professoressa Sara Pellicino is from University of Padua. She will talk about the election security and democratization process perspective to peace operation. I'm very happy to have you here. You are Associate Professor of Comparative Public Law at the University of Padua. You are the director of the Master, right, if I remember well, Master Program in Human Rights and Multi-Level Governance. And yes, I'm very much happy to see you, how you will link the peace operation and election security. Thank you.
Thank you, Laris, and thank you, Coespo, for the invitation. I am particularly grateful to General Galvano, the director of Coespo, and to all the other people that worked to put this together. So it's great to be back. So thank you for having me again. Interesting link that needs to be debunked between peace operations and election security, but I'm sure that people that have been in the field or people that are experts of this area are not surprised of hearing from me that actually the two are very much connected. In recent decades, holding multi-party election has become one of the core part of the international community's peace operations. This is now a solid aspect of what are the expectations of any peace operation that shall be deployed under an international community, UN level, global level mandate, or a regional one. Personally, I take the perspective on elections and election security from a constitutional law point of view. This is my job, and so I am one of those, I guess, boring lawyers that draws the rules that then peacekeepers are supposed to protect and implement. So again, I apologize. I think I'm gonna get a little more technical, but it's due to the actual topic that I am covering. So I thought that I'd discuss this topic with you, organizing it under three main discussion points. Discussion point number one is when. When is it conducive to hold elections in a context where there is a transition from war to peace, or where in more general terms there has been a consistent political crisis? They become very relevant because, of course, they are the hallmark of the new beginning of the transition itself, and very often they also carries a lot of political weight, a lot of political significance. Think of these scenarios that are currently the ones that are open in our region, holding elections, for example, and I'm being completely speculative here, of course, because the situation is far from that of where it would be possible to organize elections, to hold elections in general. But if you think of the situation, the current situation in Ukraine, holding election in that scenario would be a great success for one of the two contenders, but it would represent the biggest failure. Even if the peace process was not complete yet, it would represent, let's say it very clearly, an existential threat to the other side. So the relevance of elections in a context as such is not, shouldn't be taken for granted, and it does carry political political meaning, and moreover, it is intertwined irremediably with institution building. So these two moments, which seem to be on a very superficial level, evidently connected, they become actually two components of the same action, which is aimed at guaranteeing long-term stability, which evidently needs to be supported by a long-term mandate. I do see that, but in this case, the only way to guarantee that political stability that allows the long-term mandate, I think, revolves around this relationship. And why are elections and why is the first election so relevant to that? Of course, this is no rocket science, so I'm sharing something with you that you already know. If elections are seen as credible, that kicks start some sort of new phase in the political context in object, and it also confirms the validity of a certain political routine that is connected with a new phase. Of course, the worst case scenario is for elections to degenerate into violence that completely delegitimize the effort, and it kind of overlaps the electoral competition, the political competition, with the conflict itself, with a more war-oriented type of conflict. Now, the big issue would be to look into the detail on whether peacekeepers can, and peacekeeping missions and the role of peacekeepers can be beneficial to holding safe elections, and whether the presence of peacekeepers is actually a game changer in guaranteeing a safe election day. Recent research has proven that peacekeepers, despite, of course, suffering a whole series of burdens that it comes with the job that they have, and not being maybe very, very, very effective in handling the ordinary crime, so misdemeanor, if you want, or other crimes that are not connected to politics or war crimes, it has to be. So there we have a little bit of the data. Don't send back a message of complete perfection, which of course is never possible. But when it comes to elections data, recent data sets that were gathered from African countries where peacekeeping missions were deployed and where elections were held, they do show that peacekeepers do make a difference when it comes to election security, thus securing the fact that the first election is not unsatisfying, is not a disappointment, and thus kickstarting the process that comes from that. How and why the peacekeepers may find complex or complicated approaching election security. One first evident reason is that peacekeepers are normally trained to tackle wartime type of actions. So they are trained to act as members of the military in a military context. And when it comes to election violence, normally the type of situations that need to be tackled are not completely overlappable with conflict type of strategies. The objects are different, the objects of attacks are different, the strategies that are being adopted are different, and the subjects are different. So very often non-state actors that are engaged to completely stop the election process are very different from non-state actors that carry out military actions. Now, how could peacekeepers be beneficial to election security? Well, first of all, research shows that they are very useful in the pre-electoral phase, so in the phase right before election day. And this is true because they make election violence, electoral related violence, very costly. They make it costly because by just being there, they push non-state actors or other subjects that may want to carry out electoral violence. They put them in a difficult spot because they have to make more strategy, more money, and they have to put more effort. They also implement the reputation cost. If a peacekeeping international mission is in the ground during the pre-electoral phase, there is a higher reputation cost that is put on violent actors that will try to trump or stop the electoral process. However, again, very recent literature has highlighted that there is a huge game changer that has proven to really make the difference in different scenarios. And of course, this is the possibility of building a consensus based relationship with local authorities. That is, of course, the best case scenario, and this is something that has proven to be particularly effective at reducing violence in all phases of the electoral process. Now, the problem of studies like this, and I feel this physically speaking to you, is that these type of studies and these type of analysis tend to be very, they overgeneralize and they tend to be shared almost as a list of recommendations, or what I like to call toolkit approach. Like we have the guide, we have the handbook, we're going to give it to you, and then you're going to be able just to implement it and perform fantastically and grant a transition. Of course, this is not the case. Before, it has been highlighted that every situation, every country has its own specificities, and these need to be taken under consideration. Uh, Democratic assistance and institution building does need to rethink the role it has at an international level. We do need to take a different approach in order to escape some of the contradictions that were highlighted by the speaker before. So I thought very briefly to offer an example, again, highly speculative, but let's imagine that hopefully in the future it could be possible to organize a first election in Ukraine, which would be the crucial features of this case that would have to be taken under consideration when thinking or organizing peacekeeping oversight of elections. Well, for example, something that is very different from other experiences that are generally the majority in Ukraine, the role of the judiciary in auditing elections and solving electoral conflicts is very solid. It's not something that is surprising. So building on an already existing tradition could be of great help in designing a system of justice of elections that makes them more legitimate. Think of the role that the Supreme Court of Ukraine played in 2004 at the time, of course, of the revolution. Civil society activism is another huge feature of the Ukrainian context. So in this, for example, I think is very different from other examples that were brought before. I decided not to cover election security in Afghanistan because it's a very, very complicated example. But I think, for example, that here we have a complete contradiction. Again, also the form of government is highly politicized in that context, while elsewhere it has been less. It hasn't been very difficult to push for institution building towards a presidential form of government in Afghanistan. This in Ukraine would not be unattached to political meaning. There was one specific side that was pushing for a presidential system and another side pushing for a different form of government. Thus, the institution building choice would carry a lot of political meaning, and we would have to be very careful not only in designing the constitutional form of government, but also the electoral rules that carry it. This is why also, if I may, it would be very important to focus very much on the figure of the presidency and on the electoral system that should not build on the divide between the rural West and the industrialized East, despite the fact that we're already looking at a scenario where this divide may be actually the border. So again, very speculative, but just to offer you an example of how a toolkit approach would be a failure in this case, and it would need to be adapted to these features. One last but not least, which is specifically relevant for peacekeepers, there are countries that already have an experience in holding elections during difficult times, under conflict, during a conflict, or under war conditions. Ukraine, for example, is one of those countries. They already have held elections in Donetsk under very difficult conditions, and very specific arrangements regarding IDPs have already been taken. And this is a system that, again, I use this as an example to say that I strongly believe that the way in which peace missions, peacebuilding missions, peacekeeping missions should be intertwined with the local system of organization of elections is to support and to guarantee the fact that any form of electoral violence should be highly costly for those that carry it out. By making it very costly, it would be possible to minimize this possibility and also to build legitimacy and credibility for the election as a rite, as a ritual in the community. So I want to conclude by saying that election security will, in my very personal opinion, will be a test for the way we design peacekeeping missions in the future and the way we design especially curriculum of training for international police units. Personally, I want to close with, again, a special thanks to the COESPU. I was given the amazing opportunity to work as a trainer for police officers in a POC project, especially on election security. And what I can share is that it is fundamental to discuss, for example, roles of the chain of command during elections, or how would you enter a polling station. I know this sounds very banal, but from the experience of election observation and electoral assistance at an international level, I can tell you that that makes a difference. Having a knowledge of how to conduct as a member of an international force in the context of a local election. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for this tone of hope, projecting us already at the end of the Ukrainian war. Really appreciate it. I share with you, COESPO should be training and exercising every day, 365 days per year, because it's really very much important what is taught here. And you can get the importance of this once you are deployed. Before that, you don't understand how important is the preparation and the training of people here in this house. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Major General Giorgio Spagnol. Thank you very much for being with us. Major General has been European Union Director of Operations, specifically responsible for the operation for Altea in Bosnia-Herzegovina. He has been Director of the Post-Conflict Operations Study Center in Turin, and Director of Force Readiness at NATO in Belgium. Thank you very much for joining us, and you will share with us the evolution of the Italian contribution in this operation.
Evolution and challenges.
And challenges, please. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Last year, Secretary General Guterres promised to draft a new agenda for peace preparatory for a summit for the future, slated for 2024, at which leaders are meant to discuss a broad set of potential United Nations reforms. Italy supports this initiative to review peacekeeping operations, reorganize the department dedicated to peacebuilding, and reform the United Nations architecture. The aim is to reduce the need for the organization to act through large-scale peacekeeping operations and instead favor prevention through high-profile political actions. Peacekeeping is not an end in itself. This is why, rather than attempting to do everything, the United Nations should focus on its core objectives and move away from the so-called Christmas tree type of mandate, which includes every wish and desire of what UN would like to achieve. Overly ambitious mandates without the necessary resources are a sure recipe for failure, which will undermine UN credibility. A healthy dose of pragmatism and humility is necessary to make a peacekeeping mission successful. Italy is the first contributor of peacekeeping forces among Western countries and the seventh contributor to the peacekeeping budget, as well as hosting an important UN logistics center in Brindisi. 44 Italian military missions and operations are currently inserted in the UN, NATO, European Union, and national interventions. Italy's current contribution is the largest among all developed states, as it employs around 7,000 soldiers. So far, however, limited attention has been paid to assessing missions. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, as well as the debate about European Union defense and NATO, have stressed the need for a detailed analysis of Italian operations. There is the need to create standard and systematic evaluations as events proceed, to establish transparent and inclusive assessment when interventions are completed, and to plan strategically for long-term proactivity rather than short-term reactivity. In the last 3 decades, Italy has participated in an extensive number of operations across the world, including those in Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Sahel. So, what is the role of Italian peace support operations? At first glance, they are instrumental in pursuing the country's national interests. The potential that Italian peace operations have in advancing the country's interests and promoting its foreign policy is extremely significant. Yet, despite all of this, limitations concerning the country's domestic and foreign policy still exist. In essence, while Italian peace operations have frequently served the country's national interest, at times they have failed to secure the objectives that Italy was pursuing through such missions. Why? The reasons are rooted in Italy's domestic politics, which affect its foreign policy as a result. If Italy is to maintain its remarkable role in global peacekeeping, the country should resort to its political, security, diplomatic, military, and academic communities working in concert and without unnecessary delays. The Italian involvement in UN missions does not have just a military nature. It is widely appreciated and became a veritable model because of the Italian contingent's capacity to deal with local populations in a civil and human way, without upsetting the local context, while providing to the complementarity between the civilian and military dimensions. It is a respectful behavior that wins both hearts and minds of the local populations, a broader sense of legitimacy compared to countries that are more contested among the people living in war zones. Italy is the top supplier among Western and EU nations in terms of both military personnel and highly qualified police forces to UN peacekeeping operations. As for the military personnel, the Post-Conflict Operations Study Center located in Turin is involved in 2 main areas of activity: research, study, and development of post-conflict operation issues, and education and training of national and international military and civilian personnel. The so-called Italian way to peacekeeping, starting in Lebanon in 1982 with General Franco Angioni. It is based on principle of intercultural communication, listening, understanding, and communicating by creating and maintaining contacts with locals and by overcoming cultural, linguistic, and behavioral barriers. The aim is to empower local authorities so as to avoid a culture of dependency that creates apathy. The success of an intervention depends on gaining respect and trust of the locals and involving the entire country system at the political, diplomatic, military, economic, and cultural level. Following General Angioni model, the instructions given by General David Petraeus to American troops in Afghanistan were, your first thought must be to establish a presence. You need to live in your sector in close contact with the population and share the risk with them. Get to know the people, history, religion, and culture. Walking, sleeping in villages, night patrols, these are all things that seem more dangerous than they are. But they establish contact with the locals, who in turn will begin to see you as real people they can trust and interact with. No longer aliens stepping out of an armored box. Don't get drawn into reaction operations. Focus on the population. Go ahead with your plan and fight the enemy only when he gets in the way. So you will earn and keep the initiative. As a matter of fact, while a closer look at the modalities of Italian military interventions shows a substantial reluctance to use force, the role of monitoring by the Italian Parliament should be improved. Too often, Parliament quickly discusses and approves operations in summer, after months of deployment have already taken place. Such discussions should be better informed, examining missions on the basis of proper details and analysis, avoiding a muddling through process that simply gives continuity to previous efforts without assessing results or the effect on national interest. After 30 years of military engagement, Italy needs to develop a structured, transparent, and inclusive process to assess lessons learned and establish best practice guidelines. Political institutions should therefore begin to assess the results obtained and analyze the approaches of the last 3 decades. For instance, while many other countries have already developed such processes, especially concerning the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, Italy has only slowly begun. Bottom line is, it is necessary to guarantee a broader, more participatory and wide-ranging debate to guarantee our armed forces greater clarity regarding both their international commitments and the financial resources available. This, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, General, for sharing with us the fundamentals of the Italian way of peacekeeping legitimacy around the world. And I would like just to quote you, without unnecessary delays. Ladies and gentlemen, generals, we did it well. Thank you very much. I think we have to congratulate our speakers. We are sticking on time. With your permission, Deputy Commander, I would like to pass to Marina the audio, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask you to be part of the family picture outside in the para ground. Then you can enjoy a 20-minute coffee break, which is also in the cafeteria. The conference will restart at 16:50. Thank you.
And anyhow, thank you very much to the speakers of the second panel that are here with us today. They have really a challenge. Now the challenge is to stick to 6, maximum 7 minutes for presentation. That I think is something almost impossible, so really mission impossible. And I would like to begin immediately with Professor Strazzari. Professor Strazzari will talk about the sociological perspective to peace operation. Thank you very much for coming. Professor Strazzari is Professor of International Relations at the Pisa-based Scuola Universitaria Superiore Sant'Anna. And he just, I think, a few months ago, published a very interesting book. Unfortunately, it's in Italian, right?
That was in Italian, yes.
And it is Ukrainian Border War, Geopolitics and International Order. Professor, the first challenge is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be back. And now my task, which is quite challenging, in 6 minutes, I'll try just to say something about in line with what was said by the colleagues and who spoke in the first session regarding the way, the context in which we are acting contains a number of challenges that are being picked up and are designing new trends somehow. And I'm a professor of international relations. I engage this area through a critical gaze. So I'll start by saying that the context, which often is not mentioned, is one whereby the war on terror, which started 20 years ago, right, next month it will be 20 years since Iraq was invaded, has ended, has not ended. It has ended de facto. There was no clear statement regarding what we have learned or not learned vis-a-vis the way in which interventions that were coded under that genealogy of policies have brought about results. And I think this is important to understand the way in which peace operations over these 20 years have changed. A lot has been said already, moving from being under the UN scheme, something that was designed in a non-ideological way as what it was possible, the famous Chapter 6.5 of the UN Charter, and in a situation whereby it became, by the end of the Cold War, an area where it was possible to see that global governance was growing. There was a significant amount of activity there. The budgets were expanding, and it was a sort of flagship of the liberal international order. Now, we all know that the situation today is one rife with geopolitical tensions, where the element of consent is wearing thin, internationally speaking, and that has reverberations in terms of the way in which other actors, and I think today is a good day to talk about that, because we have in Europe the Foreign Affairs Minister of China, who has announced an initiative, for example, on Ukraine, a negotiation initiative on Ukraine after meeting French President Macron. And this is important. Why? Because there is clearly a number of actors who, over the past 20 years, have developed a model, an approach to peace, an understanding of the way in which international institutions should be used in a participatory but also revisionist manner. We are discussing the question of the existence of revisionist power. It is certain that China, for instance, has been, and the numbers are quite speaking by themselves, has made an investment, 25 operations to which China participated, a number of areas of skepticism, for example, in the use of robust mandates that has been withering away. Strong emphasis, of course, on elements of sovereignty and some area of caution when it comes to questions that have to do, of course, with the liberal tenets, with the norms and principles that we usually associate with liberal democracy. And this is important because, as I said, peace operations have been aligned during the 90s and the first decade of the 2000 and of the new millennium, have been aligned with the liberal international agenda, with questions of elections, with questions of human rights, with question of gender, women, peace and security agenda, with issues regarding transparency, with issue regarding anything that fits the preferences of the pen holders in the UN, those who actually in the UN Security Council, for instance, had an important role in designing the operations. So what happens is that China is increasingly making visible its own preferences in its participation, and it meets, to a certain extent, the preferences of African countries that were not present at the time in which the architectures of global governance were designed, simply because they were mostly under colonial rule or emerging from that, and which try to develop some form of visibility in making their choices in a rather pragmatic manner. If we observe what happens with the war in Ukraine, we all see that there is a gray area of pragmatic abstention, and when you talk to African leaders, what you get as an answer when you try to touch the question of the rules-based order is, no, we have done already that. This is another white man war. We're not interested in double or triple standards once again. The result of that is that there is an objective convergence over the past 10, 20 years in terms of what could be a model that is alternative to the, or to some extent reformist, let's say, of the liberal democratic agenda when it comes to peace operation, which is one de-emphasizing questions regarding the liberal democratic core principles. And it's on the contrary looking more at the developmental piece. Let's not forget that China codifies fundamental rights in terms of socio-economic rights, and looks more into questions of sovereignty and so on. But the question I want to stress, which I think is important, is that Western democracies, to the extent to which they are being contested, US President Biden announced, for instance, that the African Union will have a seat, a permanent seat at the G20 as form of recognizing this pressure which exists. What is interesting in my point of view is that that tendency, that is not the tendency to make peace operations global, which was already there, but the tendency towards transforming peace operation more under the aegis of stabilization missions, strengthening civilian protection mandates, anticipated use of force, and a number of other characteristics happened with at the driving seat there was Western democracies themselves. So the paradox of this mechanism is one whereby we have seen a rise and transformation of peace operations for about 30 years since the end of the Cold War, in a direction which in the end, we see that a country like China, which aims clearly to challenge US hegemony when it comes to the global picture, finds the path somehow facilitated by the way in which peace operations themselves were developed. The West itself, under the presidency of Trump, actually withdrew from the presence in terms of leading and funding operations. China has been, on the contrary, putting more and more money in operations. And finally, African countries, probably if there is an inflection point, it is the day in which, on the crucial question of the doctrine of responsibility to protect, the decision was made to authorize the use of force in Libya. Well, the African Union 3 days before had just said no intervention should happen on African soil without our own position, and it was totally ignored. That was a moment of public humiliation which created the conditions for looking for alternative steps. Summing up, because I know I don't have time, I believe that there is something moving under the sun that we have entered, and we have entered also because of the way economic crisis and the war on terror were fought, a post-liberal era, where there is a discussion and an area of contestation that is not simply represented by Russia and the kind of confrontational line, but there is an area which is somehow converging around some reformed model where China is trying to some extent to capture consent also at the level of UN, because China is a member of the Security Council, and for example African countries or Brazil or for that matter Turkey are not. And it is possible, I believe, I see some signs of that we're going to see a shifting of the consensus, not so much in terms of seeing peace operations in the future less global in the way they are conceived, but where the dominance in the structuring, for example, who leads the operation at DPKO in New York and so on, is no longer to be taken for granted that the mold, the matrix, sits with the Western democracies. There's going to be a negotiation there, and there will be elements of contradiction which are opening up for possible conflicts, missed opportunities, but also perhaps for renegotiating in the line that was stressed before, a new agenda starting in 2024, a different idea of peace operations once some of the most acute tensions are de-escalated. I will stop here and just suggest this as a possible line of reflection. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for your sharing with us your thinking about the crisis of liberal democratic agenda and, of course, to drawing us to the reality as a peace operation as a tool of real politics and of national influence. The next in line is Professor Michele Brunelli. He is coming from the University of Bergamo, is Professor of Conflict Management and State Building Process and Director of the Master in Preventing and Combating Radicalization and Terrorism. An extensive experience around the world, in Africa especially, and in Burkina Faso. He works on the prevention of violent local extremism and on the promotion of civil society's participation in democratic renewal. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for this invitation. So let's stay in Africa. You know, that's one of the main postulates in political science and more practically in the international relations is that power vacuum does not exist, or better, power vacuum cannot exist for a long period of time. This because in a power vacuum, other forces will tend to rush in to fill the vacuum as soon as it created, perhaps in the form of armed militia, insurgent groups of warlords. And so you know that Anomi has been the best ally of Daesh in occupying and conquering vast regions of Syria and Iraq. This because the Islamic State offers local population rules, laws, security and stability instead of anarchy. And in the last 2 decades, we assisted to a huge number of examples in which national states and legitimate governments lost their power. This also happened in the Sahel region, which in recent times have seen many coups d'etat, where a regular army tried to give a solution to the national disorder and to the ineptitude, if you wish, of local civil governments to fight against local jihadist groups. Just think about Burkina Faso, for example. And so January 2033, this year, marked the 10th anniversary of the launch of the French Operation Serval, aimed at countering terrorist groups' presence across northern Mali, soon followed by Operation Barkhane, deployed throughout the broader Sahel. Today, the region continues to be established by a plethora of violent non-state armed groups, including various Al-Qaeda and Islamic State-affiliated organizations. And alongside a constantly worsening security situation and political instability, the Sahel seems to have turned into a major stage for global powers competition and strategic rivalries. Today, this area represents a safe harbor for Al-Qaeda and Daesh militants because of the lack of sovereignty and of the state control over its whole territory. It also enjoyed of the decision taken by President Macron to change the French approach toward Africa, announcing the end of its Barkhane anti-jihadist mission after over a decade, saying a new strategy would be worked out with African partners. United Nations tried to give an answer to this situation, but today more than 50,000 troops are deployed for UN operations in Africa, and 10,000 more deployed for regionally led missions in countries where civil wars, insurgencies have killed civilians and threatened to destabilize surrounding region. Many experts agree that peacekeeping missions help to protect civilians, and reduce some of the worst consequences of war and of insurgent groups' actions, but say they are often deeply flawed. In these areas, UN missions do not enjoy the support of local population. And a debate persists about how to make these missions more effective, such as by looking to non-UN initiatives to bring peace to conflict-stricken part of Africa. Today, half of the dozen UN peacekeeping missions around the world are in Africa. But despite these missions, security and governance trends across the region continue to deteriorate. During the last 2 years, 4 coups d'etat in Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, plus a failed attempt in Niger, have increased the tensions between external actors and the transitional governments. European populations are quite reluctant to deploy more forces to the Sahel, given the related risk, the failing track record, and focus on Ukraine. Similarly, although the United States is rightly concerned that the French withdrawal in Mali had undermined the other multilateral missions, there is a little political appetite in Washington to increase US forces in the region beyond their existing security force assistance roles. The continued spread of violent extremism and terrorism as a security threat could also diminish in demands for UN peacekeeping in favor of non-UN military operation, but open up the intervention of other powers. So which are the threats and challenges? The withdrawal of traditional geopolitical actors of the area favored the penetration of other geopolitical actors, such as Russia, acting in this region through its so-called private military company Wagner Group, the so-called Kremlin Longa Manus. Wagner has immersed itself in Libya, Madagascar, Mozambique, Central African Republic, and Sudan, leading training exercises, fighting anti-government forces, and brutally killing protests. The group offers the Russian state a valuable tool, that is the ability to test new environments for military cooperation without appearing heavy-handed or overtly involved. I recently see a lot of these brawny men, blue eye and blonde hairs in some northern regions in Burkina Faso. They're not Africans, of course. So the presence now is very, very high. Moreover, Russia has pioneered a model of disinformation to gain political influence in Africa, especially towards the so-called special operation in Ukraine that is now being replicated by other actors across the continent. Despite the urgency of this threat, it has been challenging for states to find the appropriate answers, and past and current responses of states in the region and their international partners have also so far proven largely uncoordinated. Repressive security measures are indeed often counterproductive and inflate defense and security budgets to the detriment of education and social sectors, while reducing the space available in society engage in necessary dialogue. The lack of a robust post-military strategy, including plans from defectors from disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, and for reconstructions, has also proven to be a significant challenge, as the void is often filled by violent extremist organizations and criminal networks. So, in conclusion, where are we now? Today, the future of Western externally military operation in the Sahel region looks bleak. Most assessments of them identify serious problems and limitations, such as military defeat of the transnational networked and locally embedded jihadists is unrealistic. The sheer size of the territory with the forces available makes the objective impossible to achieve, and recruitment for non-state armed groups continues because of the absence of the state authorities, bad governance, and security forces' human rights abuses. The fundamental problems for international military missions are that no single actor can cope with the Sahel's challenge alone, and no external actor can solve the underlying causes of these challenges without active cooperation from local partners. Perhaps now is the time for international actors to emphasize a DDI strategy, that is diplomacy, development, education, in how they respond to the multiple crises facing the Sahel. And so, what we could do, a joint cooperation between security forces granting local security and civil education society acting and operating in the field of prevention of radicalization or in elaboration of de-radicalization strategies will be suitable at the local level. In this way, a synthesis between a top-down approach and the bottom-up approach could be found. The top-down approach is referred and demanded to security forces, granting security and stability of the territory, while the bottom-up approach is to secure society through education and training, rendering the society more resilient to radicalization. For example, through specific local programs, enhancing personal skills and competencies, which are the base of citizenship. We started to do this with different projects in Burkina and in Niger. Our approach is training and education in a safe environment. Since 2019, we have been obliged to act only in urban areas, avoiding rural regions, rendering our job incomplete. That's why security on the field has become fundamental. Otherwise, all our efforts will be vain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Brunelli. The civil society and defense system cooperation is becoming really leitmotif of today for this conference. I'm very glad of that. And you paved perfectly the way to the next speaker, Professor Winrich Kühne. That is, I think, online with us. I see you, Professor. Hi.
Yes.
Perfect. Professor Kühne is a member of the International Advisory Group to the UN Peacekeeping Lesson Learned Unit, and he's a founding director of the German Center for International Peace Operation. It's an honor to have you. It's here? Yeah. It's an honor to have you here. I give you the floor. The next 6 minutes are yours, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, the minutes are becoming less, I understand. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. I regret not to be in Vicenza again, where several people I know very well.
Professor, unfortunately, we lost you. Can you hear us? I will wait for instruction for the IT office, and otherwise we can move forward with the next. Okay, I've been informed that Professor Kühne, if you can hear us, we will move forward and you can take the floor later. It is? Oh, no, it's here. Can you hear me? I don't hear you. Just a second.
You hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Go on.
Okay, I try to be quick again. Yes, Kabul, August 21, the dramatic withdrawal of West and the chaos with refugees at the Kabul airport, because the Western intervention and the international intervention completely broke down in a few days, which many people surprised. At that time, commentators, and that hardly coincides with what Professor Brunelli has said about the Sahel area, that actually what we are witnessing possibly is a breakdown of a strategic element of international peace and security in the last decades. That is peace operations and peace buildings in many parts of the world. Don't forget, we had at certain times with UN, EU, NATO missions, about more than 20 missions annually with more than 150,000 uniformed people in the field. Now, the prediction at that time was that Congo and Mali would be next cases. And I partly agree, we have to be careful because we have to really look realistically at what is happening in the country, in Mali and in Congo. I will only address Mali because I think there's not enough time for the Congo, and that will partly overlap with Professor Brunelli said about the region. As you all know, Mali is now there, MINUSMA is there for more than 10 years. It's one of the most dangerous, is quite costly, but it has experienced 2 military coups, so democratization, stable governments is not developing. Security sector reform and disarmament is as big a problem, I would say, as in Afghanistan. Corruption is still on. The jihadis are proliferating. And now recently we have, as of course mentioned, Russia and the Wagner Group, which is supporting the Goita military government. Now, it's very interesting. In January, the Secretary General made an interesting report to the Security Council about an internal assessment of the mission. I think the assessment is quite realistic. One basic sentence is, violence has not become less in this 10 years. Civilian protection is probably worse than before, so we are really not on a direction of success. But then they came up, and that leads to the discussion with all the Professor Shazzari has partly opened about alternatives, with 3 options for the mission, for the future. One option is to reinforce the mission with 3,600 additional soldiers, so to be more robust, but still not fighting terrorism. The second option is leave it as it is, reconfigure it. I don't know how much that will improve, probably very little. The third one is, and that is an interesting and challenging one, is withdraw the military arm and the all uniform, complete withdrawal of all uniform participations of the mission. That would, of course, be dramatic. Now, I think we have to seriously discuss this, although it's unpleasant. There's many who say, no, we can't do that because that would too much damage the credibility of the UN as a peacekeeping and a peacemaking organization. That may be, but the reality is that the very problematic performance of the mission in Mali, in Congo, in Central African Republic, or wherever, on the question of protection of civilians has made them extremely unpopular amongst the population. Professor Bubinelli has mentioned it, and I agree. I'm quite impressed how the mood has changed in West Africa and the Sahel area. I've trained West African peacekeepers in the Kofi Annan Center in Accra in Ghana. It's quite dramatic how the change of the mood is. Partly Russian propaganda, partly populist propaganda, but very damaging. So I'm not sure whether it is not a better idea to say, okay, if certain conditions are not met by the Mali government, which are substantial for a functioning mission. You all know the issue, the status of force agreement, that in free mobility of airplanes, of missions on the ground, which is not the case right now. Then we withdraw, instead of suffering, even becoming more unpopular. As you know, in Congo there have been demonstrations against the mission in the eastern Congo, because the situation is deteriorating. One of the big rebel groups, the M23, is coming back. There's a little bit a better message than Mali, because the East African Commission, under the leadership of Kenya, has already engaged in sending an intervention mission, mostly diplomatic, but all the backup possibly by the use of force. So I think we are really in a very difficult situation in terms of the global significance of peacekeeping and peace operations. And whether it will be able to find another concept, I'm not so sure. I think it might be necessary to withdraw missions to prevent further damage. As you know, some countries, not only Germany, are considering to move out of Mali because they think it does not make any sense in it. Okay, I hope I was not too long. This is unfortunately a big topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Not too long, perfect. And thank you very much for sharing your points of view and your experience with us. Now I'm passing the ball over the ocean. We are going, if I'm not wrong, to United States of America. With us is Victoria Holt. Victoria Holt is the Norman and McCulloch Junior Director of the John Sloan Dickes Center of the International Understanding. During the Clinton administration, she served as a senior policy advisor in the Bureau of Legislative Affairs in the United States Department of State, and later she was stapled to be Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Security, Bureau of International Organization Affairs, State Department. She, I think, will bring us the topic of the protection of civilians in peace operation from the United States perspective, of course. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Professor, and a warm greeting to you and to all those people. I would love to be there in person. COESPU has a fantastic reputation and is known for its innovative work and its sustained training and effort. So thank you for the invitation. I'd like to offer a few points. I've been asked to be strategic and to focus on lessons learned, amongst other things. As noted, about half of my career was in the US government, but the other half was at think tanks and research efforts, so I have tromped around in UN missions, and I remain inspired by what I saw in the field that's frequently not captured well. That includes being escorted by UN police officers to small villages in Congo where there had been mass rapes, traveling around in Haiti and Liberia, and watching relief efforts in places where there's been disasters. So I will first start with sort of talking a bit about the role where we are today with peace operations and then modern challenges. And I think it's important to look at the politics of the moment. It definitely feels like we are in a strategic shift. And for peace operations and other tools to work effectively, we have to recognize them. But we shouldn't forget that the enterprise is important, that this is an international tool that is unique in trying to prevent the return of conflict and help countries and their people recover. But at a time when no new UN missions have been approved for nearly a decade, since 2014, we have to be mindful of those challenges. So, very quickly, first, the missions today come from past failures that were corrected. If you go back to the 90s, you quickly remember that after the Cold War, the huge growth in missions led to a massive mismatch between missions sent out to do ceasefires and political monitoring where peace agreements collapsed and civilians came under attack. Mozambique, Cambodia, Haiti, Somalia, parts of Central America, but most famously Rwanda and former Yugoslavia. Peacekeeping was declared dead by the mid-90s, and the world shifted to coalitions, regional organizations, and other enterprises to use peace enforcement. But that then returned to UN missions again, because after you have security, everybody came to realize two major things. One, you needed governance, you needed rule of law, and for security to be maintained, people had to believe that they would be secure without taking up arms. And second, it led to a shift in recognition of protection of civilians. And that is important for us to remember, because even as ECOWAS and NATO and the European Union and Australia went in as interventions, these missions got handed back to the UN, and today most of those nations are at peace. And that's where people like in COESPU, rule of law, civil experts, judges were sent in, courts were set up, the whole justice system became part of what peacekeeping did. The second shift, as mentioned, is in protection of civilians. And at the core of it, missions are meant to provide a secure and stable environment where people are safe. But that is often not what's happening, at least not at the operational and tactical level. Even if strategically there's a peace agreement. And I must recommend the immense work. While the first mandate for protection of civilians was in 1999, it really was almost a decade later where a concept of operations began to get developed, where handbooks were written, and today you can read the UN handbook on protection of civilians at all levels for the whole mission, whether you're a civilian, a police officer, a uniformed military, and how to think about this as strategic, operational, and tactical, as well as something that happens before and after potential physical harm. Biggest challenge there is, I think, making sure that home nations prepare their personnel for what they'll face in the field, and that concept works for everybody. That's important too, as NATO has adopted a protection of civilian strategy, as has the European Union and other regional organizations. But let me shift to the topic at hand, which is the geopolitics. So if the first trend was don't have mismatch with ceasefires, second, adding rule of law and governance, third was protection of civilians, fourth, and that's where we are today, is a real return to so-called the primacy of politics and peace agreements, because we see too much fragility. As my colleagues have already said on this panel, the peace agreements are either wobbly or often collapse in places like Mali, South Sudan, Western Sahara, and others. Or the political missions also face challenges. I would add Somalia, Libya, Yemen. Host nations have also been challenging. While they give consent in the beginning, they restrain freedom of movement. They undermine the memorandums of understanding. They will kick out human rights reporters and slow deployment or haggle over land rights. And we've also seen them invite in mercenary groups, such as the Wagner Group. So, alongside this, we sometimes have internationalized civil wars, non-state actors, high levels of IDPs and refugees. So we've got to get back to politics. Some colleagues and I looked at this a few years ago. We came up with a few basic lessons for missions, drawn on 5 major case studies of the current large multidimensional operations. The first is pretty obvious that the political strategy should feed the mandate, not the other way around. That should be developed in the field. We also recognized and found that peace agreements may not accelerate the solution set and could actually inhibit the political role of a peace operation succeed, even as it could be a crucial entry point. And this is important because sometimes the peace agreement itself does not stop the killing. It can actually just slow things, particularly when the parties are either insincere or the agreement does not address the underlying causes of violence and conflict. But given these limitations, there are ways to point to better peace dividends, better analysis of who the actors are in the field and the causes of violence, how to support local peace processes, and building out the tools that mission leaders and mission personnel need. So that leads us a bit to today, and we are asked for some creativity. There's renewed research and studying, including on political economies and peace building and how that actually can work in this current environment. Maybe that's part of the next wave. And I will note also nations including Italy's leadership on the UN environment strategy. Strangely enough, efforts to make the UN have a positive legacy and operate environmentally sound in the mission could also lead to peace building. When the UN brings in hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on its own energy and resources, it could indeed buy those resources, including energy, from local communities and jumpstart access, including to renewable energy, in places where there's low access to energy, and leave that behind. We've been working with colleagues for the last 4 years on studies to show how we can do this and to accelerate that change in the field. Could become a form of peace building. There's also good work going on with transitions, partnerships, and other ways to make missions more tuned in to the larger economics underlying the conflict. I recognize I'm at time, so let me come to a different point. It's not just making missions work better. We have a fight on our hands. One of our earlier speakers talked about a Western liberal values. I'd like to note that the UN Charter is of all nations who believe in a rules-based order, who believe in sovereignty and territorial integrity. So when we've had double vetoes in the Security Council over the conflict in Syria, and Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine, despite having no argument really for why it could possibly do that as a member of the Council, it undercuts the very principles that we are trying to uphold within the UN system and the international order. And I would say those geostrategic trends are worth a fight. They're worth upholding the system where might does not make right, and that the lives of civilians are important, and that peace agreements should be abided by. So I do not have an easy answer, but I think we do need to be mindful that those politics are not just small quibbles between countries, but ones that we really must enduringly fight for democracy and against those who would invade other nations. So a few observations, back over to my chair. Thank you for the chance to speak to you.
Thank you to you, Victoria. Thank you, Victoria, really. And of course, please come here. It will be a good occasion to see each other once again. You are pushing the ball on another side of the world, to Africa. And it is with us, I think, yes, we can see it, each other. Ramon Adebayo Karim. He is a member of the Nigerian Bar Association, solicitor advocate of England and Wales, and currently the coordinator for the African Union Compliance and Accountability Framework Project at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. Thank you very much for joining us. And if I'm well informed, of course, I think that you are today to focus on the lesson learned by the African Union in the various peace support operations in Africa, especially in the areas of collaboration with the United Nations. Please, your 6 minutes, sorry for that, 6 minutes are yours.
Thank you so much, Prof. Actually, my understanding is that I'm to speak on the lessons learned with regards to compliance and accountability. And so I will try to do that within the next 6 minutes. And on the behalf of my principals here, we appreciate that the opportunity given to us to make this intervention. Let me start by saying that the African Union missions tend to operate in asymmetric theater of insurgency and counterterrorism. These are theaters where belligerents don't feel constrained by the provisions of IHL and international human rights law. If you look across at the continent, I listened to Professor Brunelli and Dr. Victoria. You look at the Cabo Delgado area of Mozambique, where you have the Asuna Jama. You look at the Horn of Africa, where you have the Al-Shabaab, and then you go through the Lake Chad Basin of West and Central Africa, you have the Boko Haram, and then you have the situation in the Sahel, where Professor Brunelli has already indicated. What this shows and what it underlines is that African Union missions are not peacekeeping missions. And I listened to General Kuzeli when he was talking about neutrality. African Union are not neutral in our engagement in order to pacify and to defeat belligerents in our various theaters. We are also not constrained. Part of the lessons learned is that we are not constrained in the use of force. Within the UN concept, we actually have, we are mandated by under Chapter 8 to actually deal with the belligerent in Somalia, in Lake Chad Basin. And occasionally, we have the capacity to intervene in a theater, even without the consent of the government. Because if you look at across our areas of operation, you find a number of things common. The first is that we are fighting in built-up areas with the attendant consequences for protection of civilians. We are dealing with our soldiers are dealing with child combatants, children not older than 15 or 16, but who are veterans of combat operation in Somalia. How do our force deal with them? We are dealing with combatants who are laying IEDs in built-up area with the attendant consequence on protection of civilians. And we are dealing with combatants who are using civilian as shield, who are using civilian as suicide bomber. So in almost all the areas where the AU operates, there's a very fine line between who is a combatant and who is a civilian, who is a child and who is actually a fighter. And as a result of that, part of the lessons the African Union has learned over the years was to actually have a comprehensive approach to dealing with insurgencies in a way that, in the first instance, complies with all the applicable IHL provisions, and in the second instance, we don't constrain our soldiers and our FPU from discharging their mandate. And what we therefore done is to have this African Union compliance and accountability framework. And central to that compliance and accountability framework is the principle that our troops and our police complying with IHL and IHRL in the mission area is actually a force multiplier. It's a force enabler. And like Major General Spagnon mentioned, if you want to win the heart and mind of the local populace, you have to ensure that you respect their rights, you protect civilians. So quickly, we have three approaches to compliance and accountability in our missions across the continent. The first one is preventive mechanism. We put a number of measures in place, including a policy document, including mechanism to ensure that violations do not happen in the first instance. Then we have what we refer to as response mechanism, and that is if violations do occur in any of our mission area, what do we do to ensure that we bring into justice those who have planted the AU rules? We have a number of things, but due to constraint of time, I cannot list them all. But I can talk about our in-country court martial, where we ensure that if our force are accused of specific grave violations in the mission area, instead of prosecuting the officers concerned in the TCC, we will bring the court martial into the capitals where the mission is and prosecute them there, which would then allow the victims who are national of that country to give their evidence in their natural environment without traveling to the TCC to give evidence. The third approach is in the area of remedial action, and that is what the AU do to ensure that we protect civilians. We protect victims who are victims of the actions of our troops in the mission area. Again, we have a number of mechanisms and policies which time will not allow me to go into. But all along, what the AU has learned over the last few years is that given the fact that we are not operating a peacekeeping mission, but a war-fighting mission, we have to ensure, we have to tread a very fine balance between protecting civilians, respecting applicable IHL and IHRL, but at the same time ensuring that we give our troops sufficient armors to discharge the mandate in the mission area. I know my 6 minutes is up, but those are just briefly the AU approach to lessons learned in the areas of compliance and accountability. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for bringing us the imperative of human rights in the peace operations, and really congratulations for sticking to the perfect 6 minutes. We are coming back, Vicenza. Here with us we have the Commissioner Anne-Marie Orler, Chief of the United Nations Standing Police Capacity. Thank you very much. It's really a big honor today to have you here. The Commissioner Orler has 30 years of policing experience at all the possible levels, of course, local, regional, national, and international. And she was also head of the international units of the Swedish police. And today she will share with us the point of view of the future scenarios for UN police. Who better than you? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will try. I have cut all the jokes I've cut off my speech. So let's see how this will go. It's an honor for me to be here, and today I represent the UN Police Advisor, Commissioner Faisal Shakar. It's a position I have had in the past myself. Thinking outside the box, we like to say, usually ends up in the same box. No one can really say what will happen before it happens, but we can try to expand our foresight. The world has changed, and it cannot be business as usual. The question to ask is how the UN, especially UN police, can demonstrate its comparative advantages. We clearly have a role to play, but maybe a bit different than in the past. The way I see UN peacekeeping evolving in the next decade is fundamentally different than the one in which we are embedded today. Societies and communities evolve over time, and so does UN peacekeeping and UN police. The United Nations' fundamental purpose is to maintain international peace and security. Whereas there are many institutions responsible for peacemaking, peacebuilding, peacekeeping, or even peace enforcement, the police as an institution is strategically positioned to work with communities to address safety and security needs in the long run. The police is the reflection of the communities they serve. If they change, we need to change too, and to reflect the realities on the ground. Migration of people locally and across borders, occasioned by displacement from war and constant violence, have become order of the day, as they move in search of a safer place to call home. In addition, effects of climate change, serious organized crime, the use of digital technologies in one way or another aggravate the conflict situation. It's also worth mentioning prevention at this point in my presentation. In the future, I believe we can do better to prevent communities from collapsing when the signs are all there. Turning to another area in the context of future scenarios, the climate crisis. This is where I would like to focus on prevention. In our context analysis, we need to better target the root causes of conflict, not just looking at the symptoms of an incident of conflict. When you work in a field mission, you can notice a lot of tensions, for example, between farmers and herders during the times of cattle migration and transhumance in parts of Africa. Such increased violence comes under the pressure of heightened competition over fertile water and land. We tried in the past to understand by addressing a transhumance-related conflict and looked at intercommunal tensions and threats to civilians as symptoms, but we did not always effectively consider the root causes of such social tensions. Today, there is a better understanding that the climate change associated with the shifting of socioeconomic and demographic patterns constitute one of the main drivers of such tensions. Moreover, widespread political instability, which we see in many of our current peace operations, and the proliferation of illegal smuggling of weapons have deepened insecurity across the Sahel and beyond, creating more opportunities for organized criminals, illicit traffickers, and extremist groups. It requires additional analytical lenses, expertise, and partnership within the UN entities, regional organizations such as the African Union, and others inside the country we operate. Jointly with the host state, we serve to ensure that we are engaged in seeking sustainable solutions to the tensions being brought by this invisible driver, the climate change. The agenda on prevention should therefore be at the center of our current and future preoccupation. As I stated earlier, the signs are there. Let us talk them through and see how the UN police in the future can adopt better prevention mechanisms. However, let's be realistic. Even if we adopt preventive mechanisms in future peacekeeping, the journey ahead of us is full of complexities which may hamper us along the way. Non-state actors are becoming more predominant actors, and there is sometimes a thin line which now exists between non-state actors and our host state interlocutors. Another key question we have is what will be the impact of advanced technologies on peacekeeping? Innovation opens door for new criminality and new trends. We can surrogate wars more easily without being involved directly into the conflict. Who are the real actors behind the conflict? Drones and various top-notch technologies are becoming tools used by UN police in peace operations. The social media is a good example when ideological tensions through misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech can spread and undermining security. One day the UN is welcome in host country, and another day we are not. The issue of consent is crucial, and it may get thinner in the future. Through the digital transformation strategy, we aim to position ourselves to better respond to these future challenges with cutting-edge technologies and expertise, including counter-IEDs, drones, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, enhanced base defense systems, and greater use of peacekeeping intelligence, some of which are currently being used in UN peace operations. Applying community violence reduction programs, intelligence-led and community-oriented policing initiatives, targeted operations, as well as dialogue and de-radicalization programs may be considered depending on the situation and context. Participation of women in peace process is more than just gender equality. It's about creating solutions that reflects the needs of all people in conflict-affected settings and address the underlying conditions that drive conflict in the first place. If we don't mainstream gender perspective in our current and future activities, there cannot be sustainable peace. In summing up, UN operations have become more dynamic and will continue that path. Environmental protection is being implemented to reduce our footprint and achieve our commitment to sustainable development, peace and security. UNPOL will continue to sustain peace via its prevention agenda. It will conduct in-depth and transparent communication with local police services of host countries to build capacity, facilitate adherence to rule of law, and provide training and mentoring to mission partners to improve the capabilities of host state police services in full partnership. It will foster a culture of data-driven, tech-enabled and innovative policing solutions. We need to address the issue of spoilers in our efforts to cement the rule of law in situations where there is little or none. UNPOL will continue to encourage women to participate in peacekeeping operations and to encourage local women and girls to participate actively in all aspects of society. We will continue to strengthen partnership with police contributing countries, host countries, and within the UN system. Through the efforts of all parties of goodwill, I believe that a new dawn of global peace and security is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you very much for underscoring all the coming or already present new challenges. And thank you very much for your presence here. That is really stressing the importance of the partnership between United Nations and COESPO, also for the future. Now, again, we are flying over, and again, I think that Flaminia Minelli is in the United States of America. So, Chief of Policy and Best Practices Service at the Division of Policy Evaluation and Training of the United Nations Department of Peace Operation. Thank you very much for being with us. She will disclose us that the Department of Peace Operation has been collecting contributions on the discussion for future of peacekeeping operations since September 2020, and that this issue is the work stream that recently interested also and will interest the new agenda for peace, issue to be discussed also at the summit of the future in September 24, if I'm not wrong. Flaminia, I absolutely do not want to put pressure on you, but you are the last speaker, and our director, Brigadier General Barbano, is already looking forward to deliver the final speech, so please feel free to stay in 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to COESPO for the opportunity to participate in this event, and thanks also to the previous speaker for their contributions. It's not easy to be the last speaker, but I promise I will try my best not to repeat what others have already said, and I will also not get into the existential debates on UN structural reforms or doctrinal changes. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, with changing times, the landscape of peace and security work is also evolving. The nature of conflict itself is shifting with expanded weaponization of advanced technology, the global spread of mis and disinformation, and greater complexity in the types of actors involved in conflict. These trends have created a gray line between war and peace that complicates the work of not only international organizations, but also society and governments. We're struggling to address the climate crisis, the displacement of populations, and the continued evolution of non-state armed groups, amongst other issues. In addition, growing socioeconomic inequalities pose a challenge to sustaining peace. The political conditions for UN peace operation to play a constructive role may therefore not be ideal, but to be honest, they've hardly ever been since the organization's founding. The challenge continues to be to find creative ways to contribute to peace and security and to adapt current operations to respond to the emerging geopolitical landscape. UN peacekeeping has done this throughout our 75-year history. As we work on the contributions to the Secretary-General New Agenda for Peace to be discussed at the 2023 Ministerial and the 2024 Summit of the Future, and on the finalization of the Future of Peacekeeping Operations project launched by the Department of Peace Operations in 2020, I would like us to recall that despite challenges, research continues to show that peacekeeping remains a relevant and effective tool to reduce violence against civilians, prevent conflict, and strengthen security. Peace operations help countries become more resilient by addressing drivers of conflict and ultimately sustaining long-term peace, and they help countries rebuild by restoring stability for civilians. Moreover, what we have been hearing from member states in the context of the regional consultations on the new agenda for peace proves that there remains a high level of support for peacekeeping as an instrument to support peace and security, even while there is a recognition that we as the international community are at an inflection point for adaptation in our collective security responses. This, I think, warrants a certain degree of optimism. With well over 100 member states, including Italy, already contributing personnel and assets to our missions, UN peacekeeping remains one of the strongest symbols of multilateral engagement and collaboration. It may be a fortuitous time, then, to begin to envision new formats for operations. Could the UN deploy a mission, for instance, specifically to address a regional conflict stoked by the impact of climate change? Could a mission deploy in a virtual or hybrid manner to address cyber threats or disinformation? Could we further enhance the flexibility and nimbleness of operations to address other emerging challenges, such as pandemics, following, for example, in the steps of what was done in the past to respond to the Ebola crisis? Could UN missions be mandated in ways that better provide support to regional organizations to resolve conflicts in their geographic space? Could such mandates come from not only the Security Council, but when and if appropriate, from the General Assembly as well? We are posing ourselves these questions in the context of the overall discussion on peace and security that are ongoing and that are meant to spark creative, bold, in the words of the Secretary General, thinking that may even reach into doctrinal changes. One thing that we are sure of is that it will be crucial to address the trust deficit that peacekeeping is facing by orienting our operations to be more inclusive and people-centered, even while we continue to work alongside member states to intervene in the most difficult, seemingly intractable conflicts on behalf of peace. Building trust in the hearts and minds of people will require improved means of accountability, whatever the type of the mission. We already collaborate with regional and sub-regional organizations to ensure solutions are adequately aligned with local context. But in the context of actual geopolitical challenges, partnership with regional and sub-regional organizations will become more important, including in discussions on the big issue of peace enforcement. Aside from new mandates and new means of accountability, capacity building also remains a top priority for UN peace operations to meet the demands of future conflicts. We will need skills for contextual knowledge, such as new capabilities in early warning, surveillance, situational awareness, and analytics, as well as more proactive use of existing capabilities in these areas, with a particular emphasis on their role in preventive action. To conclude, I believe that the current situation demonstrates that the need for effective operations in the field of peace and security is acute, but the challenge resides into how they can be effectively mandated to respond to changing environments, equipped and supported throughout to successfully operate, and structured in the best way to respond to needs, focusing on political solutions grounded in human rights and the rule of law, as well as fostering a diverse and inclusive array of peace actors. Thank you.
Really amazing. You practice at home, right? 6 minutes, perfect. Thank you very much.
No, but I had the phone telling me.
Thank you very much. We did it. We started 5 minutes later. We are over only for 4 minutes. I'm honored, as you probably know, I'm a reserve officer of Carabinieri, and in my very democratic way, I decided that people, Brigadier General, people prefers the vin d'honneur than a Q&A session in this moment. And this is the reason because I declare closed this workshop that I think that we enjoyed. It was very fruitful. It was very interesting. So interesting that in order to beg pardon to all the speakers, that I really thank you because you did a really great job. I never seen a conference where the speakers are really sticking on time. It's the first time in my life, and also, of course, the content of your speeches was really interesting, so much that I proposed to COESPO that it is just the beginning. I really am not joking. It's not a captatio benevolentia, but I think that we can deep more geopolitics and all the connection of geopolitics and peace operations. So once again, thank you very much to all the speakers from my side. Thank you very much for your cooperation before the event and during the event. And now I would like, I can't pass it, it's a protocol. I pass back to you, Colonel,
thank you.
The stage. Thank you very much for the final part.
The Director of the Center of Excellence for Stability Police Units, Brigadier General Giovanni Pietro Barbano, takes the floor for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair, sir. It's being the director, I will not stick to the 6 minutes imposed by the chair. But my goal, my task is to wrap up all.
Sorry, not 60.
6 minutes.
Yeah, not 60.
Not 60. So, Lieutenant General Maurizio Mezzavilla, Carabinieri Deputy Commanding General, distinguished United Nations and African Union representatives, dear Police Commissioner of the City of Vicenza, Dr. Paolo Sartori, generals and admirals, illustrious prorectors, professors, and panelists, fellow officers, experts, students, and interns present here at COESPU or following us remotely. Dear colleagues of the Eurogen 4 Permanent Headquarters and of the NATO Stability Policing Center of Excellence. Since its establishment almost 18 years ago, the COESPU has progressively improved its engagement and level of ambition in the research and doctrinal development on stability policing related aspects. This process, coupled with the intensification of the mutually beneficial cooperation with universities and think tanks worldwide, favoring the rise of the horizon scanning from an operational and tactical perspective to a political strategic one. The Conference on Geopolitics and Peace Operations, striving to identify lessons learned and future strategies, is perfectly mirroring this pattern, conducive to the enlargement of scope, magnitude, and goals of our research. As mentioned by the Deputy Commanding General of the Carabinieri, we are experiencing a period of unprecedented instability, with multifaceted challenges in an asymmetric confrontational environment, in particular after the outburst of the conflict in Ukraine. Geopolitical and geostrategic analysis and vision have become compelling for the actors in the peace and security environment. It is an unavoidable tool to foresee, possibly prevent, and in case appropriately address at best new crises and conflicts, and to facilitate the recovery from destabilized context for the benefit of the international community, detecting potential future strategies in order to optimize the resort to peace operations as critical means in the geopolitical and geostrategic arena. Geopolitics clearly assists in developing higher awareness in the community of practice on the implications, difficulties, and potentialities of conceiving, designing, and deploying a peace operation in an holistic and integrated approach, taking into account historical, diplomatic, economics, financial, military, and police aspects, as well as their mutual interrelations. Admiral Ferdinando Sanfelice di Monforte and Lieutenant General Vincenzo Coppola provided us with meaningful feedback from their experience gained in their key NATO and European Union military and police positions, identifying lessons that should be considered for future activities. Also explaining the evolution of the approach to stabilization over the last 2 centuries for school of thought, the 4 school of thought for the stabilization strategies to be possibly applied for tackling future scenarios. I additionally thank them for having reminded us to take into account the non-material factors in the stabilization operations. Professor Marco Lombardi shared the interesting lessons learned from the field by a university which is deeply engaged in the counterterrorism studies, particularly matured in Afghanistan. I thank him for having highlighted the role that COESPO is playing and could further play in the field of training and exercise, particularly putting together military, civilian, and police capacities. Brigadier General Giorgio Cuzzelli explained the use of military operations and peacekeeping missions as a geopolitical tool ranging from the first deployment to the later evolution of multinational military interventions in face of state-building challenges, asymmetric threats, and revisionist state and non-state actors. Thank you, Giorgio. Professor Sara Pennicino approached the topic from the election security and democratization angle, which is of paramount importance for the long-term stabilization. And Professor Francesco Strazzari offered us a sociological perspective that probably were unfamiliar for the participants with military or police background, but fundamental to be embedded in an holistic approach to peace and security in order to avoid, after the engagement of international community in a police operation, possible relapse into conflict and into destabilized scenarios. Major General Giorgio Spagnol depicted the trend, evolution, and challenges of the Italian contribution to peacekeeping. a better understanding of the growth in scope and complexity of the activities and responsibilities assigned to the Italian peacekeepers deploying past peace operations, assist us in identifying possible tendencies for the future and preparing the personnel and relevant resources accordingly. Allow me to highlight that having the pleasure to host the former director of the Post-Conflict Operations Study Center of the Italian Army, together with the current director, Colonel De Gaudio, which I salute, and the deputy director of that prestigious institute is something unique that really honors us. Professor Michele Brunelli focused on the terrorism challenges in the Sahel region, which has an impressive impact not only on the United Nations and the European Union missions deployed in that area and the indigenous populace, but for the security of the international community, and in premise of Italy and Europe. Professor Winrich Kuhn magistrally highlighted the Afghanistan case, and let me recall that in that theater of operation were deployed for 20 years peace operations deployed by the major international organizations. Let me express a particular gratitude to Professor Kuhn, who despite the important concurrent engagement he had in the German parliament to discuss about the situation in Ukraine, he managed to join our conference. Mrs. Victoria Holt touched the very heart of the mandates, the protection of civilians, which is the most critical and dramatic aspect of the robust peacekeeping missions. In this regard, I would like to recall that the main training endeavor of this Center of Excellence is indeed to better prepare police peacekeepers to ensure an effective protection of civilians, particularly in the framework of United Nations missions. Mr. Ramon Adebayo Karim underscored the positive experience of the African Union with the interesting human rights compliance projects, a tripartite African Union, European Union, and United Nations project aiming at enhancing the African Union capacities to ensure that peace operations are continuously planned and conducted in compliance with the international human rights law, including regional human rights instruments and international humanitarian law, as well as applicable standards of conduct and discipline, including sexual exploitation and abuse, sharing therefore lessons learned to be embedded in future best practices, possibly also by other international organizations and actors. Commissioner Anne-Marie Orlier and Mrs. Flaminia Minelli, which I salute, have provided the United Nations perspective, scanning the horizon and envisaging future scenarios and relevant mandates for peace operations. The United Nations vision is quintessential for COESPO, whereas over 2/3 of the training and doctrinal activities are oriented toward United Nations missions. While concluding that the United Nations operations have become more dynamic and will continue on that path, inter alia, I have appreciated among the key factors of change for the future the focus on environmental protection to reduce United Nations footprint and achieve our commitment to sustainable development, peace and security. This topic was indeed thoroughly analyzed on occasion of our last international high-level international conference on environmental management in peace operations conducted at COESPO last September 2022. In addition, the emphasis on the operational efficiencies to be improved through the application of new technologies is remarkable and recalls the theme of the United Nations Police Day and of the International Association of Peacekeeping Training Center conference that was held last November in Bangladesh. This demonstrates that there is a certain consensus on the key trends envisaged for future peace operations. Let me take this opportunity to underline that COESPO is particularly grateful to the United Nations for the continuous support and blooming cooperations with us, enshrined in the three meaningful agreements, and particularly an aid memoir, a memorandum of understanding, and the so-called revised action points. I'm deeply convinced that thanks to the knowledge and expertise of the distinguished panelists, the conference fully achieved its objectives. And in particular, the analysis on the dimension of peace operations in the framework of geopolitics and the relations among peace operations and the other tools of geopolitics and geostrategy. The detection of lessons learned in the solution of international crises utilizing peace operations, the deepening of our understanding and the sharing of knowledge as far as concerns the wider geopolitical and geostrategic perspective, in which the international community addresses destabilized situation via peace operations, the interrelation among different strategic factors, and the development of new concepts and strategies to tackle future challenges. Allow me to take this opportunity to announce that on 27th, 29th September 2023, we will host at COESPO an international high-level conference on cultural heritage protection in peace operations that will address this topic both from an operational and a political strategic perspective. Please note that date in your calendars, hoping you have the possibility to join the event. Let me thank very much for their gracious availability and excellent presentations the 13 speakers. Your dissertations were thorough and tremendously inspiring and stimulating. We have noted the lessons learned you have identified and the future strategies you have proposed. These concepts will be embedded in the research plan we are developing for the upcoming academic year. And I would like also to ensure our chair that this initiative to call a conference on geopolitics is already in our calendar yearly, so that we can have a moment in which we share this kind of impressions, focusing, of course, on the role of police in peacekeeping operations. Finally, a particular mention goes to the moderator. By chance, I was talking to him, Professor Laris Geiser, who has magistrally introduced and managed the panelists, making a great resort of the time allotted. And to all of those who, behind the scenes, contributed to the result of the conference. Among them, I would like to mention the Chief Research Office, Lieutenant Colonel Pierpaolo Sinconi, who is in the control room over that window, and who actively worked for the development of today's concept, planning, and organizational aspects. I conclude by inviting the experts to contribute by submitting articles to be published on our scientific journal, the COESPO magazine Advanced Studies, or on our quarterly review, the COESPO magazine. Esteemed authorities, distinguished experts, dear conference participants, thank you once more. Thank you all. Arrivederci e a presto.